Well, welcome everyone to Shaking Up Shakespeare, Directing the Bard in the 21st Century. I'm David McCandless. I'm the Director of Shakespeare Studies here at SOU and programmer, presenter, producer of these events. We've had others here. Maybe you've attended some in the past. I want to acknowledge that we had some conflicting publicity about the end time of this particular event. Some publicity said it ended at 4:30, others, the publication said 5. So if you've had a chance to peruse your program for today, you'll see that in fact we've decided that we're going to end around 4:45. kind of a soft ending. In fact, I believe that'll be the time when the disembodied voice will intone the library is going to close in 15 minutes. So maybe we can take that as a cue to kind of begin thinking about finishing up. Although I know that we're all going to want to hang on every word that's said here. If you're all as excited as I am about hearing our panelists today, I can see you feel it in the room. Well, what we've always done for events in this room is have a little bit of a brief, concise, we hope, pithy warm-up act. That would be myself today. And inasmuch as our subject is directing Shakespeare, and I think one of the questions that pertains to the challenge of directing Shakespeare is what is the text? I mean, that might be the question I start with. And what's the text to you, Tony? I don't know. So I just wanted to give a very, very brief and broad kind of meditation on that subject, and I really will try to be concise. And I'll also try to manage this mic. So, well, I think, we're all enthusiasts of Shakespeare, presumably. We're all interested in Shakespeare in performance. So one of the ways to answer this question straight away, I think, is that the Shakespearean text is a script for performance. I mean, I'm guessing most of us would agree with that, and maybe even assign priority to the text as a script for performance. The interesting thing, just a few kind of, having said that, a few interesting facts, right? Many of which you may know, but the texts of Shakespeare's that we have, the quartos that circulated during his lifetime and the folio that was compiled some 7 years after his death, they don't actually represent Shakespeare's original writing, right? The Shakespeare's authorial drafts, as they're called, or the play scripts that he presumably brought or did bring to his theater company. The quartos and folios do not correspond to that. We've lost those authorial drafts and those original play scripts. So that's an interesting fact straight away when we talk about the Shakespearean text as a script for performance. We're already at sort of one remove from what Shakespeare wrote. Also, this is a fact I'm sure a lot of you know, his plays were ousted from the stage. The greatest playwright in English theater history had his plays displaced for some 200 years after his death by adaptations that were crafted to cater to the tastes and values of the times. Some of you may know that his King Lear, arguably his greatest achievement, was replaced by a sentimental rewrite by a named Tate that held the stage till 1838, and included, among other things, pairing off at the end of Cordelia, who did not die. Cordelia and Edgar were in love and sort of rode off into the sunset at the end after Lear saved Cordelia. So that's also an interesting thing in terms of thinking about the Shakespearean text as a script for performance. Also, frankly, if you look at the history of Shakespearean scholarship, and some of this refers to, you'll find that by and large the notion of the Shakespearean text as a script for performance is a minority view. That most scholars who have approached the Shakespearean text over the years, over the centuries, have considered it as a literary text, a literary masterpiece, right? Something to be, an object to be endlessly analyzed and scrutinized, not necessarily something to be performed, or if, sort of grudgingly, right? Performance as sort of the poor relation of the literary text, a kind of eccentric and perfect reproduction. We might even say, a walking shadow, right? Or a player strutting and fretting an hour upon the stage and then heard no more. So those are, I think, interesting facts that assert themselves straight away when you define the Shakespearean text as a script for performance. So what I want to talk about briefly and broadly are specific conceptions of the text-performance relation that actually try to elevate performance, that actually try to insist on the notion of the Shakespearean text as a script for performance. And again, this is very, very broad strokes, but I'm going to be talking about an originalist, modern, and postmodern conception. So what I'm, something I said? I'm anxious to get Tony up here too, but you know. Well, so what I'm calling the originalist would be the idea that the Shakespearean text records an original meaning that can only really be theatrically conveyed in a performance style or performance mode, a set of conditions and performance conventions that emulate Shakespeare's own. And the first significant person to really promulgate this radical proposition was William Pohl. Some of you may be familiar with Pohl, no problem, as a practitioner, scholar, who very, very heavily invested in presenting Shakespeare's plays in the Elizabethan manner. He was working against a dominant practice of realism in the late 19th century, but really when we talk about realism, what we mean is illusionistic spectacle with ridiculously long scene shifts that would necessitate the Shakespearean text, which was finally being performed after being supplanted by adaptations, but it was being so heavily cut, the scenes transposed and rearranged. So Pohl rebelled, and I think, again, not only trying to rescue the Shakespearean script from this laborious illusionism, but also trying to make a contribution to scholarship. So it wasn't just about theatrical practice. He was also essentially saying to scholars, you have to account for the fact that these plays are meant to be performed. You can't just sort of get all sort of woolly and analytical about these plays and not police yourself, not sort of discipline your analysis by remembering that you're talking about a script. He was spectacularly unsuccessful, ridiculed by critics and scholars alike. However, there were other originalists or revivalists who followed in his wake and were far more successful, most notably Haydn Payne, who actually worked with Pohl and developed a method that he called modified Shakespearean staging, or modified Elizabethan staging. And it had the following attributes or features: the permanent architectural set, like a replica of the Elizabethan playhouse. This was integral to his notion of modified Elizabethan staging approach. Elizabethan costumes, original text, as in no transposition of scenes, no interpolations, fluidity of action, so no scene shifts, just keep it moving, so cinematic overlap, and rapid delivery of verse. Verbal thinking simply meaning that the point wasn't to speedily spout the lines, but to use the lines as a method of mental processing, as a method of arriving at a conclusion throughout the thought process. All this should sound a little familiar for those of you who are veteran playgoers here in Ashland. Because Payne actually dispersed this method far and wide, and he was indirectly responsible, that's probably overstating the matter. He indirectly played a role even in the installation of the Globe Theatre in London, and he definitely had a role to play in the establishment of the Old Globe Theatre in San Diego, but really, his biggest influence was here. Angus Bomer studied with him at the University of Washington in 1930. And this modified Elizabethan staging approach was a house style at OSF, really from the inception of the festival to Bomer's retirement as artistic director. And I would say, having grown up around here, I would say, in fact, it was the style outdoors in the outdoor theater for quite a while after that. Those of you, I see some of you nodding your heads have also seen those shows. So actually, that's essentially my summary of the originalist position. Again, you can see the legacy of this way of regarding the text-performance relationship, right? The original practices movements, I know many of you must be familiar with those. They've sort of sprung up in the wake of this originalist orientation. And since San Juan Rica Theater, the indoor theater as well as the outdoor theater, that are sort of replicas of the Elizabethan Playhouse. San Juan Maker, that's a bit of a side note. I'm determined to finish on time, so I'm not going there. Interesting story, though. Also the Blackfriars. So let's talk about modernism then. Continuing our broad, brief, pithy sweep here. So this, if you remember how I was defining before the originalist approach, this is sort of slightly revising that, right? So instead of thinking that the text records an original meaning, so the text does record a meaning, it does embed a meaning, but we're not going to call it the original. We're going to say it's related to the original. And in fact, as opposed to saying that the only way to theatrically convey this textually derived meaning is in a replica of an Elizabethan playhouse, we're going to say, well, the key thing really is that empty space. The architecture of the costumes, we're not worrying so much about that, but the way space was used in Shakespeare's theater, space as unbounded, space as elastic, and contract or expand as the scene requires, as the moment requires. That idea of the open stage, the empty space, very central to modernist staging of Shakespeare. And I'm going to use Taiwan Guthrie as a prime exemplar of this. Interestingly enough, in his autobiography, As I Remember Adam, Boehmer actually targets Guthrie as one of the exemplars of the kind of theater that's the antithesis of the kind of theater he believed in. But Guthrie was very much a proponent of the open stage and also the thrust configuration, and really championed the idea of the actors and audience in an intimate relationship, and sort of took that idea and created a couple theaters, at least, based on it. He was actually one of the founders of the Shakespeare Festival in Canada, Stratford, Ontario, and you'll see the similarity. This is the new Guthrie, but I've been to both the new and the old. It's pretty much the same idea, that thrust stage, that open space, similar to what we call the platea in Shakespeare's theater, again, that elastic, unbounded space. So Guthrie really was, I think, kind of one of the giants of modern theater, 20th century theater. So in addition to kind of promulgating this particular kind of stagecraft, he also had some ideas about directing Shakespeare that were different from Payne's and Boehmer's and Pohl's. And one of them, I don't think he ever used the word, but I'm going to use it, performance as presentist. Right, so Guthrie was one of the great recontextualizers. Yeah, so there's a meaning in the text that I can access, but I'm not going to put it in Elizabethan garb. I'm not going to put it in Elizabethan playhouse, because that might very well will diminish its communicative value. Right? If I really want to make this meaning land with a contemporary audience, I'm going to put it in a form that's accessible and entertaining. That's going to amplify and clarify and ramify the meaning of that play. So here's the great man himself. We figured that if the characters looked recognizable, like the sort of people with whom... How am I doing with this mic, by the way? Am I a little too loud? Do we need to go like this? It's too loud?
Hold away from your mouth.
Okay. We figured that if the characters looked recognizable, like the sort of people with whom we are familiar and whom we can place in the context of our own experience, it would be easier to accept them as real people, not just as remote beings from another era. So there's that idea of accessibility, familiarity. Also, he put forth the idea that, well, the director is really an interpretive artist. Right? Yes, there's a meaning that I need to find, but I'm also sort of making that meaning, because inevitably the meaning is mediated by my subjective consciousness, right? This may not seem like a radical proposition, but remember, with originalism, it was kind of like the medium was the message, right? The message was the medium, I guess is what I mean. that once you took Shakespeare's story and put it in a theatrical idiom that was comparable to what he used, you'd kind of done it. But this idea was, no, there's some way in which my mediating artistic temperament is coming into play. Guthrie again. That your own interpretation of a work of art is flagrantly subjective seems to be regarded as an arrogant attitude, but the true view is that the interpretive artist can only make up his own comment upon the work. Also, the other person that Boehmer targeted was Peter Brook, who sort of took that idea of the open stage that Guthrie had installed in the specific theaters and turned it into kind of a concept. Right? His most famous book, The Empty Space. So yes, he's referring to physical space, but he's also talking about a way of looking at Shakespeare and looking at theater. Freeing the imagination of the audience was really what was crucial. So as far as what's a text, what text for Brook was just empty. It was an empty shell. It was a ghost of a lost original. But he said, with a creative journey on the part of the artist, the theater artist, they undertook a parallel creative journey. They could nevertheless find the spirit of the play. They could reach that inner play, that mysterious essence that, if found and enacted for the audience, would give the audience access to something beyond the naturalistic, beyond the superficial, would give them access to the metaphysical, the existential, right? And this production is so iconic. Maybe some of you even saw it. I've talked to people who've seen it. But this was regarded as sort of the height of achievement of modernist theater making, modernist directing. Midsummer Night's Dream in a white box with actors on trapezes and an empty space. I think, again, thinking about Guthrie as someone who believed that meaning had to be made as well as found, Brook would say, well, you find it by making it. I also can't resist mentioning, before leaving the modernist mode, I can't resist mentioning this book, not just because it celebrated Peter Brook's Midsummer Night's Dream as the exemplar of how Shakespeare should really be done in the modern era. This book came out in 1977. But also the revolution that Stein envisioned was based on the fact that at this one moment in time, it was like far away from poor William Pohl, there were actually a whole bunch of stage-centered critics who were in the vanguard of Shakespearean scholarship. And for one moment, it appeared as though that idea of the text as a script for performance would be the paradigm. And Stein envisioned practitioners and scholars together, moving forward, learning from each other. And the revolution never happened. It was stopped in its tracks by postmodernism. So let's talk about this, wrap things up here. Remembering the way I was formulating the modernist and the originalist approach, so if you remember that formulation, this is just radically different. So the text doesn't record a meaning. Performance doesn't. Performance doesn't convey text. Performance, in fact, is an autonomous entity. The goal of performance is to create an event, which is in no way answerable to, no way beholden to the text, right? So this, the text then becomes, in relation to performance, an incitement to invention, right? A sort of cue for the muse, as it were, material to be used, and once used, disposed of. So kind of a dispensable prop is another way of looking at the postmodern concept of text. And this whole notion in postmodern conceptions of the performance as other to text. So this is about as far away as you can get from the idea that the two is inextricably tied. One of the ways of, if this notion of other seems a little much, and maybe my graphic does too, I think one of the ways to grok it is just to say that, well, if you think of the text as connoting the full range of a play's conceivable performable meanings, and you think about a performance as one of those meanings, and of course, looking at it that way, right, performance can't enact text. So the idea that performance doesn't interpret text, but text incites interpretive activity. So you have, in fact, interpretation as process, right? That what the text incites is a vast, collaborative, creative labor a vast improvisation upon an idea that eventually materializes, and it's interpretable because there was interpretive activity. Right, so another thing we would say about a postmodern approach, replacing a literary conception of text with an anthropological understanding of performance, so that the meaning of performance is sort of accumulative, right? Meaning accrues according to the material circumstances of the production's creation, according to the mode of representation that's used, according to the public discourse that it generates, and also, most particularly, the ideological import of the way it addresses the cultural moment. Right, so here's a concept now of performance, not looking back at text, but looking at culture and participating in the negotiation of cultural values, doing cultural work. Right, this is a key sort of concept, and it does overlap with performance studies in the sense of disdaining literary paradigms and training the gaze on an anthropological, sociological, political understanding of performance. The interesting thing about performance studies, those of you who know performance studies, right, it disdains also the text. It's about non-scripted performance, so that the more Shakespearean performance critics hanker after the paradigm's performance studies, the more they have to kind of get rid of the text. And a lot of Shakespearean performance critics do, in fact, aspire to that. So they do ghost the text. Just one final thing I can't resist saying, because it addresses directors and maybe as a segue into our panel. There was one work in particular that I think has been very influential. 1995, William Worthen, Shakespeare and the Authority of Performance. And he talks about, among other things, about directors. And he kind of decries or laments, anyway, this odd phenomenon that he finds that directors habitually attribute to Shakespeare their most outre inventions. Right? They cite Shakespeare to authorize their most audacious inventions. They claim the text has sanctioned choices that are clearly extra-textual. So, in a way, he's saying that directors are either kind of deluded, sort of idol worshippers, right, the bardolaters, that fetishizing the text, or they're frauds. They're, the artful dodgers, in the sense that they will, in fact, sort of resort to a peculiar kind of self-validating self-denial, right? I didn't do it. Shakespeare did it. So just what I want to end on is just my own little critique of this idea and my own sort of sotto voce kind of affirmation of the necessity of text. Simply that the problem I've always had with this particular critique is the sort of untenable extremes that it posits, right? On the one hand, textual fidelity. On the other hand, this kind of anarchic intervention. And it seems to me that you can find a middle ground there, that you can talk about the text as a unique artifact in its own right that has a describable, discernible content, but it's also, in the hands of performing artists, it is a kind of shape-shifting entity that can accommodate the content of the artist's imagination. I think that's, to me, a more useful way of looking at the text-performance relation these days. That, yes, text is material for use, absolutely, but in being used, it melds and merges with the theater artist's fancies and needs. Well, I'm so tempted to just end, but I did have a Beethoven-esque finale here, because this is totally self-indulgent. But I wanted to say, okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about text. Here's what I'm talking about. I just momentarily was debating even to do it because I was so determined to end on time, but here we go. A script awaiting transmutation, not transmission, but transmutation. A play that Shakespeare in some fashion wrote. A story comprised of a sequence of actions running on waves of dazzling catalytic speech that bears evidence of having been shaped to some aesthetic, thematic, philosophical, ideological end that exists in its own right, asserts its own value, and exerts its own pressure on the contours of performance. But wait, there's more. A multivocal entity engendering multiple valences, to be sure, but ultimately not simply a cue for one's muse, nor a vessel empty to import one's plundered for matter, but rather an essential reference point for the process of creation that sparks, and the performance it ultimately enables, a substantial, if evanescing entity that generates and circumscribes the sprawling, strenuously wrought spectacle that materializes in its name. Performance offers both the unfolding of the thing and the thing itself. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Let me introduce our panelists now. I'm very excited about this discussion, and I know you all must be. I will return this microphone. So, I first want to introduce Tony Taccone, who is he was the longtime artistic director at Berkeley Rep, so I'm sure you all know, and I know for a fact that having retired, he's not slowed down at all. I was very lucky to get him here, and you also will have known him from some of the work he's done here. I remember his production of Coriolanus back in the day, and more recently, The Tempest. I'm sure he may have occasion to reference those. And of course, he's developed shows that have ended up in London and on Broadway. You can read the specifics in the back page there of your program. He was here, I've forgotten the year, but he actually wrote a play called Ghostlight. It was done here some time ago, not that long ago. Anyway, he also won the prestigious Margot Jefferson Award, which is touted here as demonstrating a significant impact, understanding, and affirmation of playwriting with a commitment to living theater. Tony Taccone. I also want to introduce Penny Metropulos, who was OSF for quite a while, over 12 seasons it says here, and directed over 20 plays and did some adaptations, also listed in your program, musical adaptation of Comedy Vers and Tracy's Tiger, also collaborated on an adaptation of Three Musketeers. Penny is a respected, accomplished director of the regional theater circuit, as well as having done some very accomplished work here. I also am proud to say that she's a sometime colleague of mine here at SOU, Penny Metropulos. Thank you. Also, we're very lucky to have Rosa Joshi here today. Now, anyone who's been paying attention to recent Shakespeare offerings at OSF knows all about her. She's been extremely busy, directing Henry V a couple years ago, As You Like It, just this season, and next year she'll be helming this really interesting redaction compilation of the Henry VI plays called Bring Down the House. Do I have the right title? Yes. I always have to avoid saying Bringing Down the House, which is a Steve Martin, Queen Latifah vehicle. Bring Down the House, and this is a work that actually grew out of the amazing stuff she's doing at a company she started in Seattle, the Upstart Crow, which is an all-female collective, and indeed, Bring Down the House is an all-female rendering of these Henry VI plays. Please welcome Rosa Joshi. I also want to introduce Shauna Cooper, who is an amazing artist, and I have to say I was lucky enough to see the opening in the Theater for New Audience in New York of her production of Julius Caesar, which played to great acclaim here in 2017, I think it must have been. Also directed Love's Labour's Lost here. She's directed a lot of non-Shakespeare stuff here, doing the world premiere of The Unfortunates, which went on to perform in other regional theaters. She's a member of the Woolly Mammoth Theater Company, and you can see her credits there, including The Nether, which is a really interesting play. And also a professor at Northwestern, Shauna Cooper. So I wanted to give each of them a chance to comment. I was hoping to ask them really generative question that we give each of them a chance to talk a bit about some of these issues. And then after each of them has had a chance to address that question, just we'll get into some free-form riffing, I hope. I'll be available to pop in with a question as needed. There were so many different ways I thought of framing the question about taking up Shakespeare, directing the Bard, right? I've thought about asking, how does each of you think about the text in relation to performance? Do you like that, or should we go with? I also thought about the fact, going back to those people who were adapting Shakespeare for all those years, it was like to do Shakespeare is to fix Shakespeare, and of course a lot of people accused Taiwan Guthrie of that he was fixing Shakespeare. There was something wrong with Shakespeare. He had to fix it, right? Which of those do you like? Shall I come up with another one? I'm just okay.
Why don't you talk about your approach to your new play?
To
Next year's play, yeah.
oh, bring down the house.
Yeah, just talk about it.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I would love that because I watched the video of you talking about it, and you referenced Game of Thrones.
Yeah. Well, because Game of Thrones is based on the War of the Roses, right? Right, please. Yeah, hello. Is it? Yeah. There? Is that? Yeah. So, Game of Thrones, the Yorks and so the Starks and the Lannisters, the Yorks and the Lancasters, right? The Northern, the Southern, and so when someone pointed that out to me as I was working on Bring Down the House, I felt like I had to watch the entire series. So I have a company that does all-female Shakespeare, and it's a postmodern riff on the fact that Shakespeare was done with an all-male cast, but it didn't grow out of like a sort of directorial vision or anything. It grew out of two actors. It grew out of need, right? As things do, to two female actors in Seattle who, frankly, were just tired of waiting to audition for the same two roles that showed up in a season of classical work. They never got to work with each other. They met each other in audition rooms, and they were like, "Good luck," So instead of, and then I think Seattle Shakespeare Company had also done Taming the Shrew as an all-male version also, and then, so instead of continuing to sort of bitch and moan and complain about it, they decided to do something about it, and they approached me and said, would you be interested in doing a production of an all-female Shakespeare? And I said, yes, of course. And not really having considered what does that mean necessarily, so I say that meaning that I think as artists, am I an originalist, am I a modernist, or a postmodernist? As you were saying these things, I was like, I don't know. I make work, and other people categorize that work. So I do all-female work that came out of practice, that came out of working artists' needs and desires, to create something that didn't exist before, and to move the field forward in some way by reimagining a centuries-old form. And I do think that that's my job as a director, is to reimagine that for a contemporary audience. Because I think, I don't know why we're doing classical work if it's not speaking to a contemporary audience. I don't know why I would be doing work, honestly, the way it was done, because that's the way it was done. I think that one of my favorite directors that I'm inspired by, Deborah Warner, says that she believes that you take classics and you throw them up against the wall of our time, and you should be ready for what falls back from that, and that can be controversial, and that's great, but that's how we keep the work alive. So we started doing this, and when I first started doing it, I didn't know, it was an experiment. So I feel like that's how I always enter the work. I don't know. I don't come in saying, this is what Kimler is going to be. I mean, of course you have to have ideas about it, but you go in, and it was an experiment, and I discovered things about the work. And I discovered how people viewed gender on stage. I discovered how people made assumptions about male behavior versus female behavior. I discovered gender in these plays And women discovered I never get to talk about this aspect of her work. We do a lot of political plays, and I just did Henry IV, and it wasn't an all, part one, it wasn't an all-female cast, but I cast some of the roles as women, so I cast Worcester as a woman, and she says, you know what? I never get to talk, the actor playing it said, I never get to talk about this part of the play. I'm always the whore in Eastcheap. I don't get to talk about political strategy. I don't get to talk about what it means to lead. But don't we need to have examples of that on our stages, of women in positions of power, leading, so that when we see that, it becomes normal in our lives also. I had two young men of color playing Hal and Hotspur. Young leaders presenting very different ways of being in the world. Don't we need to normalize seeing young men of color as kings, as possible leaders of our nation, as taking us into the future? That's what I feel like in doing the work that's with an all-female cast, with diverse casts of all kinds. I'm trying to reimagine these works and make them speak for an audience today, because I love text. Let me just say that I start with text. Bridget II is one of my favorite plays because the poetry is so gorgeous. But I think that if we say, oh yes, Shakespeare, the beauty of that text, it's going to live forever, that's actually going to be the death of the form that I love very, very, very much. And I love it too much to let it die by just saying, it's so beautiful, let's put it up in this pedestal and let's make sure that we put a box around it and make it beautiful, because it will die, because who's going to come and see it? How are we going to talk to new audiences? How are we going to make it relevant? So that's the kind of thing that I think about a lot. How about you guys?
Go ahead, Shauna.
I see how this is rolling. Wait, we have a question back here, though.
It's not a question, it's a request
Yeah.
that each of the speakers speak as close and use as much of the amplification.
You
Okay.
can also raise
Yeah.
it up for Mike.
Yeah.
We're not hearing what you're saying.
Oh, I'm terribly
Oh.
sorry.
You raised it
It's
up.
not that loud.
This one's
right
good.
here. That one's too loud.
Let's
Like
just do
I'm
a
right
sound check
here.
here for a second. How's that? Is that good? Okay, let's check all the microphones. We'll just do it all at once. Let's check them all. That's good.
This is not.
It's a little bit. Yeah, can we get more? Can we control this a little?
Or just maybe share the mic.
Yeah.
We'll just share this one.
Can she say all of that again?
We'll come back to a lot of those ideas, I feel. I would second everything that Rosa just said. I'm trying to figure out how is useful to enter into this. I guess I'll just talk about, I think, yes to all of those things, and it's exciting to just hear those truths, I think, about how many of us practice this work and keep it alive and named. And then I'll just maybe talk about some of the other reasons why I come back to Shakespeare, because I do direct new work and contemporary plays and musicals and also Shakespeare, and I feel like, I think as a director, Shakespeare is the most fulfilling work that I continue to do, in part because there is a level of authorship that you get through the interpretive art form, but I guess I always think about it as partnering with, I get to partner with someone who I consider to be one of the most brilliant writers I've ever worked with or on that material, and so it, is that for me?
Yes.
Yeah. Now it's gone. Okay, so we'll just hold it further away. Yeah, okay, just continue to give feedback. And I find that it makes me think in a deeper, more muscular, imaginative way than almost any of my collaborators who I've ever worked with, and I've worked with some extraordinary collaborators, but Shakespeare asked more of us than any of us knew we possessed. And so I think it makes you grow and change and evolve as an artist and a human being, both working on those plays and I think probably seeing those plays, or probably wouldn't come to see them. And for me, a lot of what I look for in a Shakespeare play when I'm deciding what to work on, when I get to decide, or what are the plays that feel like they're wrestling with the moment in time that we're in, which is a little bit connected to this Deborah Warner idea of throwing a play up against the time that we're in and seeing what comes back. And you know, in the last few years since the 2016 election, which is, I think, a lot how I'm thinking about like the last phase of my work really is, it's a volatile time in our country. Not just about politics, but also about who we are as a nation and as human beings, and in terms of identity and all of those questions. And so for me, getting to work on a play like Julius Caesar, for example, you know, beginning rehearsals in the month where Trump is beginning his tenure and getting to wrestle with a group of artists of what it means to have the soul of your country at stake, to truly feel that, to actually feel that, and the cost, investigating the cost and consequences of using violence as a tool for governance, and what is the impact on our nation when we make those choices. What it is to be doing that play at a time where we are living out some of those questions, and Shakespeare happens to, I think, be one of the writers who gave voice to those questions in a kind of muscular, spiritual, emotionally raw way that we just, it's one of the great plays on those subjects. So if we're at a point in our nation where we're critically in conflict about those ideas and those ideals, what better play, I think, to engage in or with as a group of artists and as a community than Julius Caesar. And then similarly, I guess it was like the year after that, I started working on Taming the Shrew at the height of the Me Too reports that were coming out. And there was the artistic director who I pitched Taming the Shrew. I love the play, and many people do not, but he called me after all of those reports started coming out, and he said, do you think we can do Taming of the Shrew in 2017, 18? And I said, I think we have to do Taming of the Shrew, because to me that is a play, and I believe from Shakespeare's perspective, I'll just make this bold statement that any of you all can contradict, but I think it's a play that is a satire or clown show about the absurdity and danger of the patriarchy. And then within that, there is this radical love story between two people who are in some way proposing a new system because the current system is so broken. And to me, I feel like, well, what better play could we be engaging with in the midst of this moment where we're only just starting to uncover the depths of the ways in which misogyny are embedded in every aspect of our culture and our systems and our societies and ourselves, and what is required to change that system, and what kind of bravery and risk is required, and what kind of mistakes might we make along the way, but what better play to actually propose a kind of radical and risky love story in which people say, maybe we don't have to just accept the status quo, but we can change the status quo. So this is a good question, right? What do you do with that ending? So I also propose, again, can be in conflict, but that if you go through that line, I'm a big advocate of text, and if you go through that line, that final speech, Kate's final speech, line by line, and actually change what the change is, I think you start to see a woman who is in the midst of a radical kind of act of self-realization and awakening. I think that there are a couple of sequences that are problematic, even with that take. The way I interpret that final speech is the act of someone, the bravery and risk-taking of fully abandoning yourself to another human being, and what is marriage, and what is true lifelong partnership, if not the vulnerability of that, and that she is in fact, one of the reasons she speaks for so long is that she is thinking ahead of her time and ahead of anyone else in that play. There are a couple of sequences that it's hard to work out, but by changing, and this is where this question of how do you bring the text into 2018 was when I was doing it, I think I changed 6 pronouns and 1 word, changing women to people. I am ashamed that people are so simple to offer war when they should beg for peace, which is actually, I feel, a statement we could all get on board with, right? But if you say, I'm ashamed that women are so simple to offer war when they should beg for peace, it's complex, right? That's a harder thing to get behind. But you change that 1 word, and I feel like if you can change 1 word and 6 pronouns in one of the longest speeches that Shakespeare wrote, to me that means that his point of view, that the argument that he is making in that speech is actually closer to what I am proposing he was saying than not. And if it could sustain that many hundreds of years and still be relevant in that way, that's a remarkable act of insight into love and marriage and humanity. I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Well, I have not been directing as recently as my colleagues here, but I have done some. And I guess I'm going to go back to this shaking up Shakespeare thing because I thought about it quite a bit when I saw the title, and I thought, when have we not shaken up Shakespeare? And I was thinking about that from the very beginning, that we've just done it all the time, and I think we're all, I agree, you know, it's like, I think as soon as we get our hands on something, we are actually addressing it from the point of view of where we are right now and who we are in that moment. That's what a director is coming up against. And I come from an acting background, so text was always what led and what continues to lead anytime I'm working on something. And I guess what I'm going to say is I find that when I get in a room with someone, with a group of actors, no matter what my ideas have been up to that point, and no matter what concept has come about with the designers, as soon as the actors get their mouths around the words, things come alive in another way and things shift and change. And that is always going to be the case, I think. I think it's going to keep us alive and keep us thinking about. I don't think there's any time you can go into these plays without rediscovering something. That's what makes them so rich and wonderful. I guess I'm just gonna say that I am so on board with the idea that we can look at the plays afresh in terms of gender, in terms of how we approach the plays, in terms of changing single words, in terms of all of this, and still keep the integrity of the text. I think that is, that's just a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. We're all postmodernist, I guess. I don't have too much more to say on this subject.
You know, what you're seeing here is a unanimity of feeling about the fact that we all live in our own history. We all live now. So we are carrying the issues, the forces, the contradictory forces of the particular moment in which we live into anything we make. Anything we make. And so it's impossible to be an originalist. That's an insane idea. Like, I'm going to recreate something that you can't even do it. It's like me trying to say, I'm going to do Penny's production of, like, I'm not Penny. You know, I'm sure she's very grateful for that. You know, so we are people who have a worldview. We have come up, we have constructed a certain analysis of the world on our own. It's our job as and responsibility as a director to be as articulate and clear about that as we possibly can, and understand how we are marrying, or how we are in dialogue with this thing called a text. And so when you're in the presence of a great play and a great writer, and I would not limit that to Mr. Shakespeare. I've had the same experience when I've directed Beckett or Brecht or Kushner or Churchill, where you are in the presence, you are in the imaginative presence of a great artist. My first job is to understand what they were trying to do. Well, what they were trying to do. And with Shakespeare, it's a little harder because the language is a little more dense. I don't pretend to be an expert in this, so I hire people. Barry Kraft, who's here for many, many years, who's a fantastic scholar, and he spent his whole life actually studying every version of a Shakespeare play. So I like talking to Barry, and then we get into arguments. Because Barry will always fight for what he believed was Shakespeare's intention, with every single word. And I will say, good, we're not doing that, but thank you for the, it gives me agency. Because I understand, I understand, and he has changed my mind about some things. He's absolutely gone, like, if you get rid of that, then you're gonna screw up with that. And it's like when you cut any great play, what you are doing is you're sort of, if you have a sweater, and I'm taking out yarn out of the sweater, I better know what I'm going to be left with after I pull the yarn out. So, and when you do end up really studying a great playwright, and you understand there's a logic there. There's a theatrical, imaginative, historical, psychological logic. So you be damn careful about what you're doing, because they're better than you in that regard. So that's been fun to do that. Is to be able to wrestle with some great imaginations and to try to match that. My approach to dramaturgy is kind of simple. I try to understand what they did. I try to imagine a world which would be theatrically exciting, and I kind of pick the best artistic strategy that I feel is going to vivify the text, vivify the event, which could mean cutting sections of the text and replacing them with events. That's entirely possible within I know that Shauna, when she did the Julius Caesar, she cut certain parts of the text and replaced them with events. When you're really up in front of that when you're doing like a Greek play, right, where the language isn't as exciting, potentially, where the formal structure is really less accessible. And so you can, how are you going to do this battle? How are you going to do this battle? How are you going to do this fight? How are you going to do this? These questions trigger dramaturgy. They trigger choices. When Rosa was saying, there was these two women who didn't have work. I mean, it's just, we're much more practical and I know I went to school for many, many years, and what's, interesting and shocking about all that is that how little of that I actually use when I'm working. I mean, I love to read and I love to study, but honestly, you're trying to get 1 to 30 people to go that way. And there's a lot of issues that come up with that. And so it really, you're trying to obviously come up with a theatrically vivid and dynamic and irresistible construct that makes people want to watch. You want to entertain people. You want to make it so thrilling they just have to watch. And so, and the craft involved, of course, the great gift of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival is that it's got a structure of training people to actually embrace the enormous responsibilities and challenges of speaking the language in a way that is actually impactful. That's when I've done Shakespeare outside of this place, it's been like, whoa, Nelly. Shit, people can't talk. So that it's a different thing. So that's been the great gift of working here. I know for me and watching the great work of these guys. I mean, I still remember Penny's production of Midsummer Night's Dream. You know, that was just an awesome thing to watch, man. I mean, the way it glided, it was having so much fun with itself, and you know, relentlessly confident. And that's infectious. That's something you feel in the audience. You don't know what went on to make it, but you can absolutely feel it. So, I mean, I think we're all kind of a blend between postmodernists and modernists of some kind, but I don't think it matters. I mean, it matters to, you know, scholars, but I mean, for me, like, does it work? Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm just so intrigued at all the affirmations. I'm intrigued by everything you're saying. I'm imagining it must be a little hard to talk about text in an abstract, general way. I wonder if I would love it if each of you could talk about a specific experience as a director of Shakespeare, maybe with Midsummer, maybe with Julius Caesar, Angelica, Tempest, whatever, that would give us a little bit of a peek into how specifically you as a theater artist work from that first encounter with text through the whole process to performance. I mean, that's probably a book from each of these, so I don't mean to judge, but I think that would be really interesting to hear.
Okay, I'll start. Well, you read the play. That's a really good place to start. I just want to riff on something that Tony said, which is really true. You know, we're really craftspeople, and you know, we kind of hard workers, and we just look at what's going on. And I want to say that one of the things you do is you look at the space that you're in. The place that you are, where you're going to be on the outdoor stage, you're going to be in the Thomas, where are you going to be? That's going to start to affect how you think about the play when you first start to read it. Because I can read the play in the privacy of my backyard with no idea of a particular production in mind. It's going to be anywhere in the world. I will have one idea about it that has nothing to do with reality. But if I'm thinking about the play in terms of doing it in one specific place, I'm going to start to think about the actors. I've been very fortunate in being able to work here for a long time and know the company and be able to know a lot of the actors that I've worked with. So that comes into my brain as well. So as you're reading the text, I'm thinking about those things. And then as I'm going over and over the text, the next thing that begins to happen is, what is the theme that keeps coming up for me from that? Because we're never gonna get it all, because it's too big, it's too much. We'll get what we get for the time that we do it. And that may work or it may not work. As Shauna says about the Taming the Shrew, not everybody may even want to see Taming the Shrew. But if you are looking at it and you love it, and you got an idea, and you keep reading and reading and reading that text, that stuff starts to come out. It begins to come out, it begins to come alive in your own mind. And I think that every circumstance is going to be different. I was thinking about this in terms of the plays that I've worked on, how I've been affected by, you know, as Shauna was saying about Julius Caesar, or as Rosa said about how she feels about casting women in plays. You know, where you are in the moment in your life is going to affect how you are looking at that text. And what is so brilliant about Shakespeare is that he'll start to answer that. You know, he'll start to answer that, and you don't have to push and shove and all the rest of it. I would say that the main thing that I would do when I'm looking at the text and I get an idea and I start to kind of roll with it is I will always really look at that fifth act and see if the idea holds all the way through. Because that's the thing, you can have a really wonderful idea in the beginning of a play that is really fabulous, and you've got all these really super ideas, and you get to the fifth act and go, oh, right, that, you know. So that's why, you know, when you talk about text, that's why we are always relying on it, because we're always going back to that, no matter what. I'll just quickly mention, because people talk about Midsummer Night's Dream, which was, by the way, about 300 years ago.
But you're not bitter.
No, but I will say that when we got to the last scene of Midsummer Night's Dream, the thing that really exploded was that because I'd had the idea that the whole play was a dream, when we got to the Pyramus and Thisbe, it suddenly felt very constricted, and it wasn't a dream at all. And it wasn't until we suddenly realized, wait a minute, you keep reminding yourself it's a dream, that it opened up and that Pyramus and Thisbe suddenly were able to fulfill that, the mechanicals were able to fulfill their own dream. That is not, that doesn't in any way interfere with what the text was actually doing, you know, so that's all I'm going to say.
Can I refer to a couple of things you said, only for the All right. Okay. I'm going to riff on something that both Penny and Tony said, this idea of the fifth act, and does the idea work through the end of the play. And working on Julius Caesar, that was significantly in play for me because that was the reason I wanted to do that play, was the fifth act of Julius Caesar. And it goes back to something Tony said as well, as what is the playwright trying to do? Which is definitely a place that I always start with Shakespeare, again, because always he's so many steps ahead, and what he's trying to do, if you can figure out a way to actually do the thing he's trying to do, that's, I believe, where the magic lies. And so with Caesar, I had seen the production a number of times. I'd never seen that fifth act work. And it's such a brilliant play. And then it would fall apart in Act 5, and then I'd always hear people sort of reflect about that play, this question of why does Act 5 of that play even exist, and why doesn't the play end after Mark Antony's oration, Friends, Romans, Countrymen, and I just feel like Shakespeare's a better writer than that. If he wanted to end that play after Friends, Romans, Countrymen, or after the 10th scene, he would have done it, and he didn't. And so I was obsessed with Act 5, trying to figure out what does that mean. And so when I began working on it, I didn't have an answer to that other than belief in the text, and belief in the play, and belief that there is a reason why Act 5 exists. And so once I sat down and really deeply dramaturgically started working through it, and worked with the brilliant Barry Craft, and started just looking at the events of the play, it started to make so much sense that obviously in this play about the cost and consequence of violence and using violence as a tool for governance, that of course the end of that journey would land in civil war. Where else can that story end? And so then the job as a director, your job becomes, how do you actually realize that event of civil war on stage in the messy, sprawling cost of what that thing is. And I think if you look at the text, it seems like that's what Shakespeare is trying to do, but his way of doing it in that play no longer, one, translates to what we now understand those realities to be in concert with our own societies and selves. And you know, it's a million people running on and off stage who you've never met, who are dying, but how are they dying and why do we care? Especially when you've tracked through that play with a group of citizens and senators who are the people who have actually told the story up until that moment in time. And so that was a breakthrough for me, I think, once I understood the purpose of that text and the purpose, what Shakespeare, the story Shakespeare was telling. And so then I did start to make adjustments to the text in terms of things like reassigning certain roles in Acts 4 and 5 of that play, so that the conspirators who set the whole plan in motion are actually the people who have to fight the war and have to lose everything that they were fighting for and made that critical choice to assassinate to begin with, and you made that critical choice to use violence as a solution to solve the world's problems, that they had to then live out the consequences of that, in hopes that then as an audience we would understand the consequences of that in a more personal way because of who we were tracking through the play with. And then the other question of how are they dying? What does the Civil War look like? And then that question was really about what are the scenes in which it feels like Shakespeare's really telling that story, and then to Tony's point, how do you actually create room to manifest that event physically, viscerally, spiritually, in a way that we can actually understand the cost of violence on ourselves, again, not just physically actually, but spiritually and psychically, because I think that is the question that we're all wrestling with right now, is how do we start to unpack the cost and consequence of violence on our civic spaces, on our communities, and start to actually free ourselves from the our communal addiction as a human race to using violence as a tool to solve our problems. And I think, that is what Julius Caesar is about, and that's where Act 5 lands. And I think that's why we actually don't know what the hell that play is about, because we so rarely see Act 5. And so I think the importance actually in our responsibility as directors to go back to those plays and really try to figure out what Shakespeare was after is so critical, because we haven't answered those questions and we need his plays. And if we can do the hard, rigorous dramaturgical work to actually figure out what is in there, I think we can grow as a human race more quickly, potentially. And that's the work that we get to do.
I'm going back to riffing on what a lot that has been said. I'll turn so I'm not. The one thing I keep thinking is the play is so much bigger than me, and so in some ways that makes me feel less anxious, because I'm never going to be better than this play. This production is never going to be better than the play itself. This production will be what it is for this audience in this time. And I was going back to talking about why I always think, why this play now? Why am I shaking up Shakespeare right now? So with my all-female company, we did Bring Down the House, and then it became like, that play. What was fascinating to me in that play that I'd forgotten is the emergence of this prototypical nascent Richard III. You just get to see how his pathology is shaped, his psychology is, his pathology is spurred in that play. And so it became clear that the next production we were going to do was Richard III, with the same actor who had played Richard in Bring Down the House and the Henry Sixes. And so when this was right after the election, and I'm obsessed with politics, which is why I love these plays also, because I think they're political war plays. They're not history plays. They're plays about politics and war. And so I was thinking a lot about complicity, and I was thinking about how a tyrant gets formed, because I just couldn't help thinking about what was going on in this country and how a democracy slips away. How we lose a democracy and how we're complicit in that, and how a society creates a tyrant. And looking at Richard III, I just kept thinking about complicity all the time. How the people around Richard allow Richard to become who Richard becomes. So thinking about a moment of, I was trying to think about a moment of text that I not necessarily struggled with, but the Lady Anne Richard scene, right? That scene where he woos her. How do we understand that scene today? And traditionally, or like he's sexy. He is wooing her. She fought, like there's something about him that attracts her. Yes, and I'm doing this play right around the Kavanaugh hearings. And I'm doing this play at a time thinking about that. And I'm doing this play where young women of color coming into audition are asking me, can you talk to me about this scene? They're not just, accepting the way that it's been normally or traditionally understood. And so as we were going, I had a young African-American woman, young black woman playing the role, and I was trying to find her some agency in that role, some way. Like, why does she do this in
Sorry, was it playing Richard or
playing Anne?
playing Anne? Okay.
And a woman playing Richard too. But looking at the text again and examining it, and looking at what happens to her in the play, we examined what were her choices. It came down to survival. It came down to marry this man or what's going to happen to you next. When it came to the last line of that scene, Richard asks for a kiss, and she says, "Imagine I have done so already," and she leaves. And every time she said that line, she couldn't resist. She took it on with all the strength and power and agency that she wanted to have in that moment. As a woman living today, what she wanted to say, "Imagine I've done so already," and she dropped the mic, and left. But she couldn't do it that way, right? She couldn't do it that way, because he has to say next, "Was ever woman in this manner wooed?" He has to win. And it was so hard, like, how do we let him win in that moment so rethinking the scene and going back into the scene, I said, you don't get to have this victory because this actually happens to women all the time. And right now you have to think about how you're going to get out of the hotel room safely. What are you going to say right now in this moment that is going to let this man let you go? And you have to do this for every woman that's been through this. And that's actually the mic drop that you get, that I think about what actors have to do and the places they have to go for us to heal, to represent the things that we don't have to go through that, right? Or we might have gone through that, and then we get to see ourselves. So how hard it was for her to let go of that, what she wanted to have in that moment and what she couldn't have, in order to tell the story, which is what it comes back to. Whatever the idea is that you have about Lady Anne, however you want to tell it, it still has to fit the story that is there, that's in the text, right?
That's right.
But that doesn't mean you can't tweak it, I remember having a conversation with Bill Roush about these plays, about whether the question is, are these plays sexist or are they about sexism? Are they racist or are they about racism? And the truth is they're both.
They're all of those.
There's
things.
all of it. And so how do we, especially, I think about this a lot as I'm trying to think about how will these plays live for us for a new generation. Because I really, and here's my radical, I believe that the future of these plays lies in the hands of young people of color, who will reimagine them for new audiences and make them see themselves in these plays. Because too often I've had young artists of color tell me that, one, these plays were not really written for them, so why should they go see them? Two, they've been told these plays are not about them, they won't understand them, the language is too complicated. Three, you'll never get cast in them. Four, it's dead white male, it's colonial. All of these reasons why they've been told that their plays are not about them, and then they see it reflected when they literally don't see themselves in the plays. So how will, I think about how will this work be for everyone? If it is universal, universal can't be code for only a certain kind of person. Universal means it's for everyone, which means that we have to complicate the stories even more sometimes, or we have to deal with what's difficult in them for us as a contemporary society in order to really grapple with what's difficult in the plays. That's, I feel like, my job also. These plays are difficult, and that's why I love them, because we'll never solve them. We'll never, like your Penny's saying, like, we're never gonna do, oh, that's Richard III. I always think about, when I'm approaching it, there's the text, it's a new play, right? I know that's an old trope to say with Shakespeare, but I really believe that. Like, not like, oh, what is my Lady Anne gonna be compared to every other Lady Anne, but like, what is Lady Anne, what is that experience for somebody who's never seen the play? What is the experience of that? As if somebody doesn't know what the story is. That's the thing that I keep thinking about.
I'll just say a couple of examples to respond to the question. Frequently at the end of Shakespeare's plays, most, I think onerously in the history plays, there's a coda. You know, some guy comes out and says, oh, what dastardly events have befallen us. Let us now, all things are healed and the state can now go on. And usually I read those and go like, oh my God, we're not doing that. So I'd be grappling with what the resolution is for the experience that we've invented or created or interpreted or imagined, is that calls to, it's the fifth act. Where are we going towards? And frequently I will take what I think is the most mysterious, hardest thing in the play and try to solve that first. Try to go after that first, because it's at the heart of every great play is something you really don't understand. Trust me. You're like sitting there going, okay, how the hell? And so you come up with you create it like a narrative. You create some sort of system, a universe in which that is explained to you first. Because you're the director, that's your responsibility. So frequently I have cut those codas and replaced them with what I would call visual events. You know, so that's one way that we've gone up to the text. The other way, I'll just give like a specific example. You know, in Coriolanus, when you read Coriolanus, you're struck by this obsession that Phidias has with Coriolanus. He's his counterpart, his enemy. And Phidias is obsessed with Coriolanus and everything that Coriolanus has been accorded. You know, he's been regaled as the greatest warrior ever, and Phidias is like seething in the corner going, why the hell isn't this mine? And I wanted to sort of create an opportunity where we could really understand that in a visceral sense. So, and I stumbled upon these statues of these Greco-Roman wrestlers, which are really erotic. I mean, there are these guys that are just going after it. So I made a wrestling scene. I mean, they rolled out the wrestling mats and we scored it, and, you know, Derek Wheaton and Ray Porter went after it. And we structured a wrestling match, and Coriolanus won. But Phidias had his men jump Coriolanus, and then he took a gun and shot one of his guards. He had the gun on Coriolanus, and he shot one of his guards, because he couldn't kill the man he loved. Phidias is obsessed with Coriolanus. He could not kill him. He would never be able to live that way. So, and the other thing I did is I made a three-act kind of a structure, because for me the first act is about war. So I intercut, at the end of that sequence, the war is a battle, and it rages over the whole stage. And I intercut the two exits of the two characters. So Phidias is beaten, but he's helped by his men who don't want to help him, and Coriolanus is actually helped by his men who love him. So in the contrast, you saw Phidias going off and Coriolanus going off at the same time. So it's just like a directorial construct to explicate and, enhance the contradiction. And the last thing I'll say is that there's a lot of mob scenes in Shakespeare that I find really challenging, because you get like, there's 8 people. Yay, boo. So there's a lot of ways to have to grapple with that. And with Coriolanus, I had the great gift of having a gigantic cast, of which Mr. Richard Howard was in, which he was fantastic. But sometimes explaining the mob is frequently like the like the dumb ox. They're just a mad bunch of oxen who just screaming, and they change allegiances every, like literally 3 seconds later. No, yes, baby. You know, so I wanted to, the being a choirist, I wanted to explain that a little bit to the audience. So I basically started the play with a mad rush of basically food was being stored away from masses of poor folks. So the play opened with a bunch of soldiers throwing food into a bin and locking it up while the crowd rushed the stage and started screaming, and the soldiers escaped. And so the crowd's stupidity was explained by hunger. When people are hungry, they get stupid. But there's a logical reason. There isn't just a metaphysical statement about people are stupid. People get stupid when they don't have options, when they get crazy. And so that's just one thing that we all grapple with. Is like, okay, there's a mob scene. What are we gonna do? You know, how do we create in Caesar? You know, there's like, who's he talking to? And they're all screaming and like, you know, those 8 by, yay! Yay, bad. So, you know, you get either the soundtrack or you get the audience to take part in the whole thing or whatever. So anyway, those are just some samples of challenges.
Well, I'm just going to say one of the things about the mobs or the, you know, all of this kind of stuff, if you start looking at what's really being said to them or what's happening around it, you know, he knows these people. I'm Shakespeare I'm talking about.
Yeah.
He knows these people, and I think that that's the thing that is often overlooked. It's not just general. It's not just...
There's a lot of voices inside of the mob.
That's
There's
right.
arguments within the mob.
That's right. So you're always going back to that, and you'll find these little, you know, a little jewel somewhere that you go, oh my God, I can use that, you know, that gets overlooked otherwise.
Yep.
Great. Well, let's have some questions from the audience. A lot of you here, I imagine you must have some questions for esteemed panel, star directors.
So thinking about like Tony, what you were talking about, how when you approach a play, like you're thinking about, like you carry your whole history with it.
Sure.
So then I was kind of wondering, like as a director, like if you're doing like 2018, it's kind of like maybe Taming the Shrew or something. Like how do you make the show like make sense or be meaningful for somebody that has like a completely different history? Like I have however many years of different history that you have. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. I mean, what you're asking is like how are you in dialogue with the audience?
Yeah.
And I think that all of us have actually responded to that in some way here now, which is that, you know, you're super conscious of what's going on in the world, and so you're interfacing with that. You're trying to make intelligent choices that reveal something that feels dynamic and now and present, right? So, you know, and I don't have to say too much. I assume those things are alive in you. I don't have to say too much to activate them, you know. And what I can't do is pretend like you're all gonna respond the same way. We just reveal the most dynamic idea we can find in the most dynamically staged way, and then it's up to you. I think what's really interesting about what you're saying, of course, there are different generational assumptions and expectations and thoughts and feelings about the world. One of the most fun things I got to do as a person who programmed seasons was to program plays where I absolutely knew there was going to be a war going on in the audience. If you do a Mark McDonough play, I guarantee you'll have some people that are just laughing on the floor, screaming hysterical, and there are people furious that those people are laughing on the floor, and laughter is often a recognition of boundaries. What some person laughs at, somebody else is furious about. So comedy for me is a much more unforgiving kind of experience because you're going to create a volatility there. I imagine Taming the Shrew. I imagine. Talk about that. What was that like?
Well, I mean, I feel like with these plays, especially a play like taming that is colliding with the particularly volatile question that's happening in our societies. I think that's the reason to do those plays in that moment, because my hope in telling a story like that is that it will ignite those arguments and dialogue within an audience that are surrounding these conflicts that we haven't solved. And so you're putting forth a strong point of view, and in my case it was a strong point of view that I felt like coincided with the text, but it's a text that is people are in conflict about. And so my hope was just that leaving that play, that people would go home with whoever they had with, had that event experienced with, and they would argue about it, and they would argue about where we go from here, because the play is just one moment in time, and then the more interesting question is where do we go from here?
They were probably just arguing about how you did it.
They probably were, but that still then brings up the question of what is your own point of view about how I did it, right? And that I don't mind. I'm eager for someone to be angry about how I did it, and then for someone else to passionately argue for it. But that conversation is going to lead, hopefully, to some epiphany that might happen within that relationship that carries the work forward. Because otherwise, who cares?
All of you, each of you, has directed a performance that I consider one of the greatest I've ever seen.
Which one was those B?
That's all right. And I'm curious, speaking of text, and going back to David's first point about the text is a vehicle for performance, how do you work with actors on text to produce those performances?
Thank you for asking that question, because I think that the actor is really at the forefront here. We're up here talking about what we do as directors, but the actor is at the forefront of all of this. If you don't have an actor, you can have a great passion for the work. And I would say that probably almost every actor who decides to do a Shakespeare, especially if they've got a good role, has a passion for the work. And they get passionate about the ideas and the emotion and all the rest of it. If they don't have the chops, it isn't going to come across, because it's hard stuff. And this is, one of the challenges in what's going on right now, and has done for the last 25 years, I'm going to say, is people being accustomed to having these words in their mouth. And I'm going to say, from what Rosa is saying, to have people of all colors, of all genders coming out and being able to speak these words and own them, and learning what it is like to, having a chance to learn how to speak this work is really, really important. Because if you have people who are going up, if you have actors going up and don't know it, have never done it, have never heard it, and don't want to learn about it, that's the way we go, oh, we don't like Shakespeare. That's the way that happens. When you have an actor who's, I've been able, because I've been at the festival for a long time now, I've been able to watch year after year, season after season, young actors come in and start to grow in this language, start to grow with the language. I'm going to mention someone because she came immediately to mind. Christiana Clark, who came in here and was very, very talented from the minute she arrived. But what she is doing now, after all the work she's been doing, is just really stupendous as far as I'm concerned. So I think we have the opportunity to have really great text people, text coaches here, but it is the will and the want of the actor themselves to want to do this work and to want to get behind it. You can't just pick it up and say it. And actually, Rosa, maybe you'd like to talk about this a little bit more.
It's like singing opera, it's like dancing, it's classical work, right? So it takes rigor, and I'm a nerd, so didn't go into any of this, but when I did Hamlet, I looked at all the quartos, the bad quarto, the folio, and I put together my own cutting of it, right? So I go deep into the text. I love those thick, the OED, the thesaurus, you know, and the lexicons, and I will look up every single word I don't know. Even if I think I know it, I will spend hours just, because I'm a nerd, and because to me, you have to know exactly what you're saying, not the general gist of it. Those are the words that you're saying, and the specificity of text it's a skill, right? And then there's rhythm and music and all of that. It's like singing in speech, and what I will often say to talking to young actors is that it's like learning to ride a bike or a car. Like, the freedom comes on the other side of technique. So having that technique, and you can just do it, then you can sing, then you can really play. But we have to invest in that, and especially, again, I'm just gonna keep saying it, it's that when young artists are not let into that world, when they don't have the access, right? I think about how many young white men, talented, or, you know, but I think, oh, they're given that opportunity, and I think they're not really ready for that opportunity yet. But they'll get better, but we don't think about that. But when a young person of color is given that same opportunity, I want us to just think about how, if you think they're not quite ready, how our own bias might just go, oh, that's why we don't do that. Just honestly, that's our implicit bias about it. It's like, how do we create the same, if we're going to talk about equity in the arts, well, we are now. But you can have equity and excellence, and you have to invest in it, and you have to make the space for it, and remove our biases.
I just want to say one more thing about process. I love this, and I feel like one of our jobs too, anytime we get into a room, is because you're often working with actors from a variety of different backgrounds, is how to create a company and how to give that company the tools to really bring that language to life. And people are going to have a different amount of tools to bring to the table when you come into a room, always, with these plays. And it's one of the thrilling jobs as a director, is how you can help raise everybody up. And one of the things that helped unlock this work for me is I love the language and I love the text of these plays. And it is muscular and it is visceral, but I think if it only lives in the head, it is not as muscular or visceral as what Shakespeare intended. And so what has been important to me is to figure out ways to develop tools where actors can access a muscular physicality and a muscular visual imagination and interpretation that can be paired with the language, because I think that's actually when these plays come alive, and that's part of, you know, the moments that Tony is describing in these plays. He's absolutely telling the story that Shakespeare is telling, and he's doing it through the language, but he's also doing it through visceral, alive, physical storytelling. And we see before we can speak as human beings, and if you aren't delivering these plays on that scale as well as on the level of the language, you're actually just leaving a huge part of the play behind. And I think that's a big part of our job with actors, is to give them the opportunity to relate to access, and to personalize these plays in their imaginations, through the language and through their bodies. And that's when, hopefully for you as an audience, then you feel these plays as viscerally as they have the capacity to deliver.
I have a little story. First of all, if I'm training an actor, we're in bad shape. I'm not telling. I mean, I'm giving actors actions. I mean, we're getting very specific at that. And I'm working with actors who can pull it off. Although Tony Hill is sitting right over there, and we were doing Othello, and I had this idea that in the last movement of the play, that when Iago, when Iago's running around like a madman, trying to stitch together the last, he's got about 4 balls in the air, 5 balls in the air, he's running around. And I had this, he was literally running like a mad dog around the stage. And he was in tack, and it was like, it was hard. And I said, like, you know, Tony, we can probably simplify this. No, I can do it. I can do it. So he had this marathon. He's like a demon. He was not gonna like let me down or let the production, because he saw what we were trying to do, and he agreed with it. So anyway, it's just, that's one of the things you go through about trying to get in sync with your company, and this is absolutely right. Trying to get the spirit of a company in every production is critical to the well-being of the show.
Questions? Yes.
I noticed that sometimes the time period where you place the play makes a big difference. Like when we had a Caesar played by a woman, they set it in contemporary times, so that made it very realistic. On the other hand, recently I saw Othello played in contemporary times, and they were fighting with pocket knives, which seems kind of silly. So how do you decide what time period maybe to put a play in?
Time period, when you set a play in a different time period, what are the contradictions that you have? What are you actually grappling with?
It's, oh God, I could stop. Yeah, what do you guys think?
You think you're always right.
Well, I mean, you're doing that again, as we've been saying all along, you're always approaching the play from where you are in the moment in time. I mean, right now, you could hear today, because of what is going on today in our world, there is a passion behind a lot of the way people are looking at the plays, right? Next week it'll be something else, because that's how, well, or maybe within the next 2 hours, that's how fast things are going. When you're looking at a play, you're only thinking about how can I relate to an audience right now with what I have, with what this is in the time that we're in. You know, sometimes you get offered a play and it's literally like 2 years from now, and I just think, who am I going to be 2 years from now? How do I know what this is going to be, you know? So I think when you're setting it in another time period, you're thinking a lot of things. Again, you look at that fifth act. Is that fifth act going to work out? Are you going to use guns? Are you going to use swords? Are you going to, you know, when you have that problem of fights, what is that going to be? I mean, you're always thinking about all of those things, and I think what you're hoping, more than anything, again and again and again, is how does it relate? Does it relate? Can I do something? It's not that you're just trying to do something different, and that's why I'm going to go back to shaking up Shakespeare. I don't think anyone wants to do a play just to be different. You know, we want to enter in with the utmost respect for what the plays are, but what the plays are to us in this moment in time from where we are. That's, I don't know if that completely answers your question, but that's what I think this is.
And I'll just say one other thing about that, because I frickin' hate talking about time period in these plays. I feel like when I need to do it, everyone always wants to know that. Where are you setting it? When are you setting it? And I just feel so boxed in always from that question. I think part of it, like when I'm approaching one of these plays, the question that in my mind is going on is, what is the world of the play? Yeah. That's what I'm crafting with a team of designers, is what is the world? What are the givens of this world that are going to bring this story to life in the most visceral, live way possible to engage with all of you? And so we'll make lists of truths about what the world of the play is, and we'll bring in images and be looking at what is the world of the play. And of course, like, eventually that's going to land you in a specific vocabulary that people will connect to a certain period in time. But I don't think I personally will never talk about even doing like Taming of the Shrew set in 2018 or 2000. I think there was some advertisement about that Caesar in New York that was going around for a little while from the marketing department that said Julius Caesar set in the eve of the 2020 election, and I freaked out because it was the kind of thing that I hate. And suddenly, I think it was truly just a marketing team trying to make this play sound interesting to people. So I was just, so we changed it, needless to say. But I think that there's a way in which sometimes we talk about those plays in that way because it's a shorthand, but I think it can so easily reduce what the plays are about. And it's not to say that you're not gonna, you have to make some choices about, is it a gun, is it a knife, is it but I'm always searching truly for the choice that allows the ideas in the play to reverberate and with as many different meanings as possible. And I think if a choice that you're making can only reverberate through one meaning or through one time, then maybe it's not the right choice for me when I'm trying to figure out when and how and where to set a play.
I just wanted to say one thing that my friend Deborah Dryden, the fabulous costume designer Deborah Dryden, always says we have these very esoteric conversations as we can have about how we're approaching the plays. And Deborah, at one point or another, will just say, this is all wonderful, but I have to put clothes
But I also think that the reason that I do theater is because it takes us into a place of imagination. And it's what is the most dynamic way, as Tony was saying, what is the most dynamic event, and so this is why we connect, is that I have the same, I get to that production meeting or someone says, what period are you setting it in? And I just go, I don't know. It's the question I dread because predicted it time to go. I'll be very quick. Oh my gosh. Because I feel similarly that I'm not the right person to answer the question about the specific period, because I think there are some directors who do that really quite brilliantly and really well. So I want to just point that out, because I think that we can be, with this work, the thing that I find the most damaging is, well, this is the way it should be done. Well, this is the right way to do it. And so this is how I respond as an artist, and this is how I make the work as an artist with Shakespeare. What I love is the freedom to create that world, to create the world that invites an audience in, what I love about theater is that it is not complete until you have participated in it. It's not a painting that I can just say that's complete. It is a performing live art, and it is not complete until you complete the interpretation of it or complete the experience of it. So for me, I want to create a world that has possibilities and has suggestions for you, and that, but it feels cohesive, right? For whatever we're saying and for whatever we're creating. So the literalness of a world for me is usually something that I never want to go to, because I always want to go to something that's abstract, that is metaphorical, that is something that you can only do on stage. I'm always like, why is this on stage and why is it not a film? Why are you coming here? And what is it that the medium of theater can do for you that you can't get from seeing a really great, there's some great films and some great TV out there. And I don't, to my financial detriment, I do not want to do that kind of work. I want to live in the ephemeral world of theater where it's never the same, ever, ever, ever twice. So I'm always looking for the imagined world.
Woo!